Hello and welcome to the Slate Political Gabfest. May 29th, 2025, the Why Destroy Harvard edition. I'm David Plotz of CityCast in Washington, D.C. I am joined, of course, from New Haven, Connecticut, via Yale University Law School and the New York Times Magazine, on the byway of the New York Times Magazine, Emily Bazelon. Hey, Emily.
Hey, good morning, guys.
And in a delightful olive/forest green jumper from CBS Evening News and CBS Evening News Plus in New York City, John Dickerson. Hello, John.
Hi. I got two things to say. One, jumper is not a term used to describe children's clothing, and yet I'm just constantly think it is.
I think it sometimes is. It's a British word.
I think I listen to a lot of British podcasts, and they're always saying jumper.
But I think it's also like a short dress for kids.
Oh. But in British parlance, it's like a cardigan, right?
It's a sweater. Yeah.
Sweater.
Yeah. You're not really wearing a jumper. You're wearing athleisure.
Yeah, I'm wearing athleisure. I'm also wearing some trainers, if we're going to be speaking in Britishisms. Anyway, the other thing is when Emily says hello, I always want to respond immediately to the pull of her collegiality, but I wait, dear listeners, because I'm waiting for David to introduce me. So I don't want you to think I'm cold and aloof.
Unlike certain people we were just talking about before the show, who shall be remain nameless.
Oh, don't make us sound like gossip.
This week on the Gabfest, the Supreme Court endorses maximum presidential power in a pair of cases involving previously independent government agencies. Then, why is President Trump trying to destroy Harvard University, and who benefits if he does? And then, is adult male friendship vanishing? And if so, are wives to blame or children? Just kidding. I was just saying that to provoke you, Emily, but you weren't even listening. Plus,
I was totally
Plus, of course,
listening.
We'll have cocktail chatter.
I'm just above being provoked, beyond being provoked. How about that?
That's too bad.
Yeah.
That will really ruin the show if that's the case.
I was going to say, I thought that was the whole conceit of the damn show.
All right, fine. I'll be provoked.
Put us in a box. Go ahead. That just gives us something to break out of. Because the Next Generation 2025 GMC Terrain Elevation is raising the standard of what comes standard. As far as expectations go, why meet them when you can shatter them? What we choose to challenge, we challenge completely. We are professional grade. Visit gmc.com to learn more.
Comcast is committed to bringing access to the internet to all Americans, including rural communities across the country, like Sussex County, Delaware.
We were being left behind. Everybody around us seemed to have internet, but we did not. High-speed internet is one of those good things that we needed to help us move our farming, our small businesses, our recreation forward.
Learn more about how we're bringing our next-generation network to more people across the country at comcastcorporation.com/investment in America.
The unitary executive is having a great year. Supreme Court, which has lavishly granted President Trump powers his predecessors never dreamed of having and exempted him from laws that you would think he would have had to obey, gave him another gift this week in an unsigned opinion on the emergency docket. So, Emily, what was this ruling, and why does it, to at least a lot of Supreme Court watchers such as yourself, why did it feel very consequential, even though it was just like unsigned, unlabeled, barely just some signatures?
The actual ruling itself validated Trump's decision to remove two federal officials, one of them at the National Labor Relations Board and the other one at the Merit Systems Protection Board, without cause. So he just fired them, and he fired them even though the statute that sets up these two agencies says that you have to, if you're the president, have cause to fire the people who've been appointed to serve. Like they have to have done malfeasance or negligence. They didn't. He just doesn't like them.
They're appointed by Democrats.
They were appointed by Democrats, yes. And so the sort of background of this is that Congress, a lot of these agencies come about in the New Deal era or afterward, and Congress sets up this statutory scheme that says, yes, they are in the executive branch, but they have some independence from the president. And this is an important vehicle for their independence, that he can't just fire them willy-nilly, basically for political reasons. And the Supreme Court in 1935, in this important case called Humphrey's Executor, signed off on that theory of the separation of powers. And now, in this unsigned order that came from the court's shadow docket, meaning it was a petition from the government for emergency relief and it wasn't fully briefed and argued, they said, we think Trump will probably win in the end. And so these people will remain fired in the interim. And there's sort of two things. There's this procedural mechanism of making this big decision off of the shadow docket and sort of stealth overruling this major precedent, Humphrey's Executor. And then there's just this important question. This decision gives the president and this particular president more power. Is that a good idea? It's a discretionary decision, right? I mean, the Supreme Court could decide that Humphrey's Executor is still good law or wait for another day, certainly. And instead, they are giving this president more power. And of course, this comes in the wake of their immunity decision last summer, which I think has been hugely consequential for emboldening President Trump.
When you say discretionary decision, Emily, is that a different category than if they did all the things we expect from a Supreme Court, which is to hear arguments and da-da-da-da-da? In other words, did they take a special route here, which compounds whatever one's judgment is about this?
Yeah. I mean, they picked up this case from the emergency docket and made a major ruling, kind of tipping their hand about the ultimate outcome, and also making it so that these particular two officials remain fired, right? And so what they could have done was left the decision in place from the lower courts, which was following this former precedent in the way that lower courts are supposed to do, not reward Trump for basically like blasting through that judge-made law, and then come back to this next year. Or they also could just decide this isn't the way that they want to go. I mean, this conservative majority expressed in 2020, in an earlier case in 2020, this court indicated that this path was the one that they were going to go on. In other words, less independence for federal agencies. But they didn't have to take the next step right now, like right now in June 2025, or like right now next year.
John, this maybe is a question more for Emily, but
it's May, I realize. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
She doesn't even know what month it is. I mean, what kind of questions are you going to ask her?
Seriously. But I will ask a question anyway. The question is,
yes.
So where did this notion in American history that all power of executing the laws sort of really have to abide in the president himself and there can be no checks or asterisks on it? I mean, is this something that is congruent with the broad sweep of American history? Of course, since the New Deal, we've had these quasi-executive agencies that have had this role, and that's been 90 years, which is more than a third of our history. This has stood. But if you look at the entire kind of sweep of history, is the idea that the president alone executes the laws, and really it is all invested in this one person to decide whatever he wants.
Right.
Is that consistent with our understanding of the presidency?
Well, it's consistent with the accretion of power to the president in the post-New Deal era, but the debate continues, as we've talked about a lot on this show, and Emily will help me patch up the rusty spots here. Just for those of you at home, you can't really patch up rusty spots, but you get the point. For a long time, when the president tried to act on authority that he thought was granted to him by the Constitution in the sort of what I guess people would call the Hamiltonian model, which is that a president is required to act with dispatch and sometimes in secret. And so under the umbrella of a president has to act quickly, they would try to take power to themselves. And then Congress would say, oh, no, you don't. You stop that. And then sometimes the courts would as well. And the reason that my book on the presidency starts with FDR's attempt to try to reorganize the office of the presidency is to get at exactly your question, David. So basically the president, FDR, says, I would like some help in the executive branch because modernity is happening too fast, and all other democracies have these systems where the executive has some ability to meet the needs of a fast-changing world with a staff and doesn't always have to go through the legislature. And I want some power. I want some agencies and some control over my executive departments. And Congress basically freaks out. Previous presidents, Teddy Roosevelt had tried to do this, and Congress said, Absolutely not. Roosevelt even tried to make the federal government more efficient, and Congress said you can't even do the tests to see whether we really need to buy 293 different kinds of pencils. Literally, they stopped him from even doing the analysis. So Roosevelt is called a dictator for trying to reorganize the executive branch and ultimately gets some tiny concessions from Congress. But then time and necessity basically dump all of this power to the president. And by the way, often with the willing accession of Congress, giving him more power. We've seen it on the war-making power. We've seen it with treaties. And essentially it begins with the Great Depression and the response to that. But even so, Congress and the courts push back on executive overreach. But then you have World War II. And then you have the Cold War. And then you have the brief period in Watergate where some of this power is taken away from the president and moved back to Congress. But then basically just slowly and basically as the president becomes the center of politics and Congress disappears and we run into national campaigns where political passions and identity are all driven through the presidency, power starts to accumulate again in the presidency. And then you have the war on terror in which that happens. And so, and now you have Donald Trump, which takes those trends and, puts them on high anabolic steroids.
I mean, from a legal perspective, Emily, is this inevitable too? Was it inevitable that there become a theory of a really powerful theory of the unitary executive that extends as far as this court now is clearly willing to extend it?
No, I mean, it's a huge product of the conservative legal movement. So I guess if once you have that factor, maybe it's inevitable, but it doesn't have some unbroken past in history and tradition, as John just described, at all.
Why is it even a product of conservative legal thought? It's not a conservative idea. Why does it become a conservative idea? It begins as a democratic idea. It begins as a liberal idea under FDR.
But then Reagan becomes president and he is frustrated, and the growth of the federal bureaucracy becomes a huge frustration for conservatives, right? So look at DOJ. All of this is about not just pruning, but, kind of raising the federal bureaucracy, which is seen as putting up all these barriers to corporate expansion with regulation, right? The federal government has become, as we know, kind of boogeyman to conservatives. So if you think about it that way, it makes sense. To take a step back, I think the best argument for this is probably that you want elected officials, the president, to come into office and be able to really make change. Along the lines of the European parliamentary system, right? You want to be able to have the voters really see this president's agenda. He wants the NLRB to be super pro-corporation and against workers. Let's live with that for a few years and see what that's actually like, as opposed to the much more kind of gridlock form of government we have in which the executive agencies are kind of a bulwark against radical change, right? They sort of sit there, they operate according to their practices. They're much steadier and more stable. And they do pass regulations and do things to protect people's health and safety and workplaces. And that frustration with the whole apparatus of American government is why this is a conservative project. And if you think that's a real impediment to, American wealth expanding or whatever, then that's your philosophy.
Yeah, Emily is exactly right. And I think also to the extent that they think that the liberal ideas are embedded in the bureaucracy, that the New Deal Democratic run, which is not just presidential, by the way, a lot of this is statute from 40 years of Democratic control of Congress, gets inserted and embedded in the bureaucracy and essentially becomes a constant state of liberalism. And I would just add also to the extent that Republicans feel affection and kinship with the business world, it allows an executive to come in and act, quote unquote, as a businessman, even though we know the presidency is not like being a CEO, without the bureaucratic hurdles.
I mean, what's so interesting is this is all of a piece, and we'll get to this in our topic when we talk about Harvard, is this destruction of the idea of expertise and knowledge. The idea that there should be a layer of experts, people who are exercising judgment. They may have political beliefs and that may guide it, but that it's built on deep, profound expertise in the field that is based on knowledge and experience rather than primarily based on ideology. And this is saying that is worthless. That should not exist. That does not have a place. What only has a place is that there is a person with whom we have invested all power And what I was wondering about, and these are like, I mean, this is going to sound kind of trollish, but these are very serious questions. Does this imply, Emily, that the president could tell the FAA all planes now must fly 1,000 feet higher than they're currently flying? I want that to be a rule. Like, I believe does it imply that the president could say, I want that drug to be approved? I'm the expert. I would like this drug to be, I don't care that it hasn't passed safety testing. It's not interesting to me. Like, I know, like, I was elected president. Like, I have the expertise. I want that drug approved, or I don't want, like, this drug that appears to be safe. I don't want people to be allowed to use that drug. No more. They cannot use that drug anymore. Can he declare that every woman who walks into a federal government building must wear a miniskirt? Like, is there any limit now to what the president can say as the executive? Any government activity, anything that is presumptively executive, is there any limit on what he can do?
I mean, I don't think we're to no limits yet. Like the drug approval one, I think that order would still have to go through the processes for approval of the FDA. But I think your question gets at something important here, which is that we no longer feel as confident in those guardrails. And one reason for that is this unitary executive theory and the sense that it could be unbounded, and we don't really know where the limits are right now. Which is another problem with issuing a 2-page order off of an emergency relief petition that is just not very reasoned, and we don't know a whole lot about how it's actually going to work. And another thing is that Trump just seems to be bulldozing through a lot of the limits, and we're watching that happen in real time. And so I go back to this question of like, why? Why give Trump more power at this moment? Why, in a sense, after the fact, bless this decision he made for these firings, which at the time he made them were clearly illegal because of this older precedent. It's clear that the lower courts followed the law here. And that I'm just perplexed by that choice.
That's what interests me the most, is that there's the particulars of the case, and this will come up again in our conversation about Harvard, but there's the particulars of the case, and then there's what you're pointing out, Emily, which is this seems to be the court affirming a worldview of the way to treat courts, which is to say it's all provisionary. Who cares what courts have said? We're going to do the maximalist alternative view to what they've said and let them stop me. Because sometimes, you know what they'll do? They won't stop me. And they not only won't stop me, they won't stop me in this way that doesn't give airing to the full set of arguments, that doesn't have a full public conversation about this, the way it would if this had gone through as a regular case. So it seems to me this is an affirmation of a way of doing business in a very particular moment, and that goes across all the way.
And that is anti-conservative, right? Because I was interviewing a judge a couple of weeks ago who's like a more old school conservative who believes in judicial modesty. And he was making the point to me that law is a force for stability. And in a moment like this one, when there's a lot of turmoil and chaos, the most important thing in his view that courts can do is to stay the course, like be really steady and keep things as predictable and stable as possible. And this decision really tilts in the other direction. And I think it is the moment that makes it feel unsettling, right? We should note that there are 2 sentences in this short decision which differentiate the Federal Reserve from other agencies in order to say, like, don't worry, Trump doesn't all of a sudden have the power to fire all the people on the board of the Federal Reserve. There's been a whole debate among law professors, as one would imagine, about whether that is like a defensible principle intellectually, or whether it's just this like kind of arbitrary differentiating going on. If you are in the latter camp, then you say like, okay, well, if that's arbitrary, then this whole thing seems kind of arbitrary. Like if you're going to have this grand theory of the unitary executive and it is absolutely necessary, why do you have this like big hole in it? It makes it seem kind of made up. So, I mean, when we actually get a fully reasoned, briefed, argued round of this case, the conservative majority is going to have to do more to explain why the Fed is different. The idea is that monetary policy is different from executive power. I'm not sure whether I think that's true or not. We can all sit with that. But a second problem is that the Federal Reserve does a lot of other things that are clearly executive functions. And so then you have a problem of like, okay, well, is the court going to be like, well, we're going to allow the monetary policy part to stand, but the rest of the agency the president now has this power. It's confusing and complicated. And right now, it's not particularly satisfying how they've settled this for the moment.
Can I just add one little point about Congress? We've been talking a lot about the bureaucracy in the federal branch and the judicial branch, but there's also a history here in terms of Congress. And there was, when Woodrow Wilson writes about the presidency before he actually has to take the job, he writes about the fact that senators in particular viewed a president as a kind of amateur who came into these issues on a temporary basis. And, isn't it nice? And sure, he has some power and that kind of thing, but we are the permanent guarantors of American liberty and freedom, and we know kind of what's going on. And just compare that to the current way in which senators behave. It is a radical difference between the way they see their job and the way they used to. And so the unitary executive also rises up when you have members of the House and Senate who don't, the majority of the members who don't have their own independent identities. You might remember that FDR, when he was in office, actually picked out Democrats who he tried to primary to knock them out of office because they had opposed his positions on a variety of things. So we're obviously a very long way away from that other part of the balance in our system.
I just want to close this. I was reminded of Matt Iglesias' favorite comparative political scientist, Juan Linz, former Yale professor Juan Linz, who writes about why is it that presidential systems like the United States tend to be unstable compared to parliamentary systems. And one of his key arguments is that when you have a presidential system where you have an elected executive and an elected legislature, there's a crisis of legitimacy at some point because they both claim popular will. And when you have that crisis of legitimacy, like you can have gridlock, which is what we've had, or what tends to happen is that after gridlock, people get so frustrated that the power suddenly accumulates in the executive, and the executive, it becomes an executive dictatorship. And because we have 250, 240 or so years of history where we haven't had that, where these two elected political forces have been able to work and cooperate. We are not accustomed to it. We don't expect it. But that actually, if you look at systems like ours around the world, what tends to happen is the legislature gets weaker and weaker. The presidency becomes extremely strong and dictatorial. And here we are. This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Quince. Are you looking to elevate your gift game for Father's Day this year? Check out Quince for thoughtful, simple, and effortless pieces for all the dads in your life. I am a dad in my own life, and I have some amazing new Quince clothing. I'm wearing a Quince linen shirt that I got, a very bold blue linen shirt. I want some lighter short sleeve button-down shirts, and Quince has beautiful ones. I got a white one. I got a blue one. I think I have a black one too. I'm also wearing Quince underwear. Super comfortable. Just got a 3-pack of Quince underwear. Very comfortable. And the best part is that everything with Quince is priced 50 to 80% less than what you'd find at similar brands. So for the dad who deserves better than basic, Quince has you covered. Go to quince.com/gabfest for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/gabfest to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/gabfest. This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Home Chef. Do you find yourself eating the same thing over and over again and in need of inspiration? Home Chef is here to make searching for new meals and cooking a new dish something to look forward to. Had a great experience with Home Chef. We made a tofu banh mi in a bowl. So I love a banh mi, that Vietnamese sandwich. And Home Chef sent me all the ingredients to make basically a tofu banh mi, but instead of having it on a roll, instead of having it on bread, you serve it over rice. It was delicious. It was delicious. Me and my son and my girlfriend just gobbled it up. So Home Chef has everything you and your family need for hassle-free, delicious dinners with over 30 options a week, and they cater to a variety of dietary needs. So Home Chef has everything you and your family need for hassle-free, delicious dinners with over 30 options a week. Users of leading meal kits have rated Home Chef #1 in quality, convenience, value, taste, and recipe ease. Love their recipes at Home Chef. So easy to use, so clear. For a limited time, Home Chef is offering Gabfest listeners 50% off and free shipping for your first box, plus free dessert for life. Go to homechef.com/Gabfest. That's homechef.com/Gabfest for 50% off your first box and free dessert for life. Homechef.com/Gabfest. Must be an active subscriber to receive free dessert.
You may get a little excited when you shop at Burlington.
What a low price! You see that? They have my favorite brand! It's like a whole new Burlington! I can buy two!
I'm saving so much!
Burlington saves you up to 60% off other retailers' prices every day. Will it be the low prices or the great brands? Burlington. Deals? Brands? Wow! I told you so. Styles and selections vary by store.
The assault on Harvard continues. The Trump administration, which has, as we've talked about in recent weeks, has been extremely aggressive in going after universities in all kinds of ways, has chosen designated Harvard for extra special treatment. So this week they froze federal contracts with Harvard and started the process of transferring any contracts that Harvard has with the federal government to other institutions. That comes on top of having already basically frozen effectively billions of dollars in research spending. Now the administration is attempting to bar Harvard from enrolling foreign students. This has been held up in court for the moment, but the effect, whether it's held up in court or not, the effect is the same, because our students will not go to a university if they think they are going to be kicked out of that university, and they will go somewhere else, which will be safer. And so Harvard has already seen mass attempt to exodus the university by its international students, and I assume a steep decline in applications as well. Pretextually, the administration is barring international students because Harvard is an unsafe place that promotes anti-Semitism or doesn't protect students from anti-Semitism. It's unclear to me if the international students are being barred because they cause the anti-Semitism or because they're endangered by the anti-Semitism. Doesn't make sense. Okay. There's a broad attack by the Trump administration on higher education. There's now Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, announced yesterday they will be closely looking at any international student from China who wants to study in the United States. They've paused processing all student visas. So any student that is attempting to come to the United States right now is on delay. And of course, they're holding up billions of dollars in research funding at all kinds of universities. So we all have connections to Ivy League universities. I went to Harvard, so I have special fond feelings for it. But Emily, I want to start with you. Who possibly gains from the destruction of, or the severe weakening of, America's oldest and probably greatest research university?
I mean, I think the answer is like the people who care the most about owning the libs, right? So like Chris Rufo gave an interview a couple of months ago. He's a right-wing guy really interested in education. And he said, well, this higher ed sector, maybe it just has to be smaller. He was basically saying we don't have the manpower as conservatives, and I think it's fine to just use the word manpower there, to properly take over these places. So like we're going to take a wrecking ball to them. And I think if that's your project, then I suppose you cheer for this. I mean, it's hard for me to fathom because, look, you can be clear-eyed about the flaws of elite higher ed institutions and have lots of ideas about how to improve them. Or you can just destroy them in a way where the real prime target is the scientific research that they produce, which is of enormous benefit to everybody, right? Like when the government contracts with scientists at Johns Hopkins or Harvard to work on cancer research, people suffering from cancer, whoever they are the ones who benefit. And the fact that the United States has been the center of the universe for higher ed, like the place that incredibly talented students from all over the world want to come and study, especially for the sciences, has been a huge coup for us. And Harvard is a crown jewel of that. And so the idea that the Trump administration wants its legacy to be destroying this huge asset for the United States just is, it's just hard for me to fathom. But I think, yeah, if you think that higher ed is a breeding ground for liberalism, and this is certainly something J.D. Vance is very much on the record about, then you just want to wreck it. You just see it as the enemy.
It's interesting. I hadn't ever thought of this because I guess I'm stupid, but the way the Trump administration treats many Americans is as a defeated enemy, not as fellow Americans. Like when you conquer a society by force, when you defeat another nation in war and you conquer them, you often will destroy the institutions that undergird it to ensure pacification, to remain in power, and then maybe you rebuild them, but you rebuild them in a form that you like. I think what has been so confusing for so many people, because I tend to think everyone's acting in good faith, is that the Trump folks are treating like the EPA and Harvard not as fellow Americans and American institutions that are trying to act for the good of America, but as a defeated enemy. And that is like a weird mind shift. And when you think of it that way, it's like, oh yeah, well, of course they're willing to. They don't care about the costs imposed on them. They don't care about the violence that's being done to individual people and to even to the future of the nation, because it's more important to humiliate this enemy.
Yeah, and I mean, Trump's gaslighting comments this week in which he blamed Harvard for these problems, for sticking up for itself, is just like the ultimate example of that, as if, going to court trying to not just to completely knuckle under immediately is the sin that's driving his own responses. I mean, that's like the ultimate abusive person's way of thinking about dynamics like these.
It would be hard to come up with a better way to defeat a nation than by pursuing this, because this is obviously not just about Harvard, although Harvard drives a lot of the important things that I'm about to say. But this is part of a larger project of anti-intellectualism and support for what has made America an economic power. I mean, when you look at the U.S. has been one of the world's top R&D funders, and R&D gets done at these universities, and that's important. Obviously, not just. The reason that's important is you have independent research as opposed to funded by industry. So that puts that at risk. And so the applied research that goes on at these schools that gave the U.S. its economic advantage is in trouble. Also, 80% of America's privately held billion-dollar companies have an immigrant founder. And a lot of times those immigrant founders were educated at places like Harvard. So the companies that are the engines of U.S. growth, a lot of those people are now barred from the country. Then you think about, what are the institutions that are going to reskill the American workforce? One of my hobby horses that I don't quite have a full grasp on, but is that there is an extraordinary change going on in the world. Some people predict it will be far more fundamental than either of the industrial revolutions. And that is the change from automation and artificial intelligence. And it will, if nothing else, require a massive reskilling of people who have existing skills, and also then a training of a new kind of workforce. The administration's view of a manufacturing renaissance comes out of a kind of nostalgia for like the 1930s, which is just and so that's the problem with its tariff policies. It would seem to me that it doesn't meet the moment. But this is also a part of that problem. If half of the employees in this year are going to need reskilling, where does that take place, or where does the thinking about how that would take place, if not at these institutions of higher learning? And so let's imagine you wanted to destroy Harvard. What are you putting all of this time and attention towards in terms of finding a place to answer the challenges of the workforce in the future? If it's not going to be at these institutions, where's it going to take place? And that conversation isn't happening at all while they're destroying the one place we know research and development and training is taking place, or at least thinking about training for the next generation is taking place.
Literally, if you wanted to predict who would make the greatest possible contribution to American well-being, you would say, oh, it's a international student, an immigrant who has earned an advanced degree, probably in the sciences, probably from an Ivy League school or MIT or Stanford or something like that. If you were like, oh, who will contribute to human well-being in the greatest amount? It's that person. And now it's like, fuck you, person, get out, go do that in Singapore. Go do that in China.
And those thousands of people are all like scrambling around, really unsettled, feeling like terrible worried about their own futures and the future of the United States in a way that is just destructive for them, their own personal well-being, and for us as a world.
Did you guys read that Adam Serwer piece, which I think was in our research brief from The Atlantic, about the new dark age? So he argues that this is all part of the attack on university is also the disappearing of information, the disappearing of knowledge, the silencing of expertise, this insistence on, bullshit science and bullshit medicine out of the Maha people. It's all of a piece. And it's a willful sort of return to ignorance and stupidity because somehow it's safer or somehow I guess it owns the libs. I mean, did that ring true to you?
Well, and also that if red is extremely worrisome. And the other thing he was talking about is that when you start destroying knowledge and tracking everything from, economic data, like the impact of Trump's tariffs, to racial disparities in healthcare, that you lose all the tools we have for understanding the world. And so then people's conception of the political landscape and the impact that it's having becomes really tattered and frayed. Like you can't even point to the statistics that tell you how these things are playing out. And that is like really, really, that's, destabilizing the whole information ecosystem in a way that happens in real totalitarian regimes.
When you disappear history and research, the person who wins is the one who can bullshit the most in the moment. And so $2 billion cut from the National Institutes of Health, 1,300 employees fired, 50% of the cuts planned in the National Science Foundation. Research arm of the EPA is gone. CDC, FDA, Department of Agriculture research teams, all gone. And then you look at the attacks on the Smithsonian, the cuts to the National Endowment for the Humanities, terminations of grants to Black History museums. Like, it's not hard to accumulate evidence to support the claims that Adam Serwer makes in his piece about disappearing all areas of research and science that would cause any kind of contradiction to a riff you might give in the moment.
I'm kind of obsessed with this problem of medium to long-term impacts, right? When research doesn't happen, you don't feel the effects of it immediately. It's down the line.
Right. I mean, every senator comes from a state that has a research university, and that research university has a hospital, and it has people who have PhDs there studying cancer or studying black lung or studying diabetes. And yet they sit by and let this crime happen. It's shocking. I have one question, Emily, which a friend of mine was asking me, which I thought was really interesting. Could it be that the end goal is not necessarily the destruction of science? It's the destruction of the humanities at universities. And what the goal is to cause universities to basically hive off all the humanities and just become institutes of science and engineering, the stuff that creates material prosperity. And that, if you can just get Harvard to get rid of its Middle Eastern Studies department, its history department, its government department, its English department, philosophy department, but it keeps the sciences, that would be fine.
I mean, this is a very backwards way to go about that project, right? Because currently it's the STEM sector of the university that's being hit. But I do think you could imagine down the line a kind of separation going on, right? Where you're trying to protect parts of the university by severing off the more politically controversial parts. So in that sense, I guess that threat is real. There was a really good, I thought, essay by Steven Pinker in the New York Times over the weekend. And one of the things he pointed out is, people get so provoked by the super out of touch sounding titles for courses that just seem like, how could anyone study this? Like, it's so bespoke or silly. But he had a student who created some, I guess, like AI or something crawling through the course listings. And it was a tiny, tiny percentage of classes that actually inhabited this like supposedly risible universe. And I feel like that happens over and over again, that there is like some center at a university that really is like a hotbed for some, illiberal ideas on the left. And then it is kind of dragged way out of proportion to the whole university. And so, like, sure, I mean, you can criticize those places and you can change how they operate, but the idea that they should then threaten the entire enterprise is really troubling. But I guess that goes to your point, David, that if you just like hive off that part, then you would protect the scientists and the researchers.
But there doesn't
that, yeah,
there doesn't seem to be any interest in actually protecting the scientists and the researchers.
No.
Like, I don't see
well,
that.
right, not right now. I mean, they're the ones at risk. They're the ones with the labs. Like the joke at, schools like Yale is like, well, the humanities is relatively cheap. So for now, it's much safer, actually.
Can I try to land a point, which I think is at the back of this and basically everything else we talk about, which is that the real threat is not a particular policy outcome with respect to these schools, although those policy outcomes are really important. But it feels to me not the real threat, but the bigger threat is the replacement of institutional independence with a system of presidential dominance through financial coercion. So what you have here is, there's a systematic way of trying to address what's wrong with these institutions for higher learning. And we would agree that there are extreme cases and ways in which these institutions, like all institutions, can be better. But when you go outside of it and do it this way, where it's essentially a protection racket, where schools can get out from under this attack by exceeding on 1 or 2 points, but then survive and have the larger project. By exceeding, you weaken the support of the norms that operate through proper channels. And that doesn't just affect schools. It affects formation of legislation, regulation, judicial review. And it normalizes the idea that basically power is the determinant here. There aren't other ways to do things. So every time a university capitulates or a journalistic organization capitulates, it validates the approach of that it's basically legitimate to run things like a protection racket. And that, I think, and what happens is a lot of times when we cite all the facts I just did earlier is it focuses us on the micro, when the macro thing that's happening, no matter what, is the affirmation of kind of governing through protection racket, which it seems to me to be like a large and systemic challenge.
Summer's heating up, but the savings are cooling off. It's your last chance to shop Blinds.com's Memorial Day mega deals. Blinds.com invented a better way to shop for window treatments, completely online with upfront pricing, no showroom markups, no salespeople in your home. Choose from classic shutters to outdoor shades and more, all backed by our 100% satisfaction guarantee. It's your last chance to shop Blinds.com's Memorial Day mega deals. Save up to 50% with minimum purchase, plus a free measure. Blinds.com. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Hey there, my name is Jody Avirgan. Have you noticed the present day? It feels pretty rocky. Well, I think history can help. What's more, this little country of ours, the United States, it's turning 250 soon. So how did we get here? On this day, historians Nicole Hemmer and Kelly Carter-Jackson and I sit down to look at stories from the past. Silly, surprising, deeply relevant, that feel like they have something to teach us about today. This day, 3 times a week, you can find it wherever you're listening right now.
John flagged for all of us an essay in...
No,
did I?
Give not John
it wasn't
credit.
John? Oh, I thought it was John.
Did you just talk like Yoda? Give not John credit.
John did not flag. Let's leave this in. Let's
Action.
leave it all in. This is all about men.
Action, adventure. A Jedi Knight needs not these
diminishing
things.
women as part of their attempt to.
No, that's
the
really
reason
not
that
the theme
But
of the essay.
but not pull me into this framing because I did not
Precisely.
suggest that I suggested it.
Okay.
Anyway, carry on.
Emily, who has lots of deep male friendships, including with me and with John, flagged an essay in her own New York Times magazine, perhaps, by Sam Graham Felsen, "Where Have All My Deep Male Friendships Gone?" And it's a personal essay by this writer about why it seems that for men, or certainly middle-aged men, male friendship is in trouble and loneliness is on the rise. And it is an exploration of what that means, and can it be stopped? Should it be stopped? Well, Emily, you're
This is all
not
your
a man.
fault.
You're not a man, but it does appear to be your fault, because one of the chief objects of blame is the companionate wife, the companionate spouse, and the children that the spouse insists on bearing. So
to be clear, Sam Graham-Felsen is not blaming those people. He's observing the changed dynamic.
What is it? What is he? Can you just start by describing what is the phenomenon he has identified, and did it strike truth with both of you?
So he starts by talking about his like very intimate, close friendships from when he was a kid or a teenager, or even in his 20s. Just like the endless amount of time he spent hanging out with other guys, doing all kinds of things. Those were the most important relationships in his life. And then becoming an adult with a family, like you just said, David, and seeing this big shift in priorities where, you know, for a while when you have little kids, I think a lot of people have trouble making time for friendships. But my own observation, and I wonder if this rings true to the actual men here, namely you guys, is that so that kind of separation, I think, happens. And then I think that it is often easier for women to just assume that the intimacy of their friendships is going to bounce back. Like that the way I hang out with my friends tends to go right toward very sensitive subjects about, you know, family or work, whatever, just that they go beyond the surface quickly. Even if I haven't seen one of my dear friends in a long time, that's sort of why the friendship continues, is that you can just kind of get past all the surface stuff right away and just kind of pick up where you left off. And I think that at least in my observation, that for a lot of men that's harder. So they tend to, when they do figure out how to hang out together, it's often like because they're either playing sports or watching sports. And when I listen to their conversations in my own house, they don't tend to be about like close things. And one of the things that Sam Graham-Felsen says is that he's talking to a friend who says like talking about the wives is off limits. Like we don't do that. But I definitely talk about my husband and my kids with my really good friends. I mean, hopefully not in a way that would make them feel betrayed, but they're absolutely not like off limits as subjects.
Well, that's one of the challenges with the piece, which is it's a sort of memoir in part. I mean, it's a highly personal essay, which is great, but then when you extrapolate from your own personal experience, it gets a little weaker to feel, or as a reader, you don't necessarily sometimes feel like one person's lived experience represents either a new phenomenon. In other words, it may always have been us, or that it represents some larger correct view of the world. First of all, let me just say, thank God we're getting a chance to talk about men because, you know, it's been a desert, really. Anyway, I don't know how much this is a new phenomenon or how much it is just the kind of current version of an old phenomenon. This has nothing to do with men, but this week, Meg Oliver on CBS reported about new findings that show mothers who self-report on their mental health have said the number who say excellent has been declining at a precipitous rate since 2016. And she talked to a counselor who explained the reason for this is the gender roles are all still the same, but technology has hyper charge them, so that if it's always true that the mom is the one that gets listed on the emergency form, the husband is constantly sort of relying on their wife to keep the house in their head. If that's been a societal challenge, that technology has made that constant. You know, you're always available with a smartphone. You're always getting pinged by your kids or your husband, and so it has made a situation we well understood even worse. And so I wonder if there's any technological piece of this that might be explored that wasn't in the reading we offered.
I have a lot of thoughts on this. First of all, I do think it was always us. I know certainly my mother talking about my father, a very sociable, lovely, humane man, did not really have male friendships.
Same with my dad. Same with my dad.
And I think it, and of course, some of it is marriage and some of it is marriage. So I think Sam is correct to identify that one of the changing ideas about marriage, which is that you have a companion at marriage where your spouse is also your best friend, does have this effect of also cordoning off or sort of makes friendship, you center friendship in your marriage too. Like that relationship is a friendship, not just a kind of romantic / economic partnership. It is a friendship, and that diminishes other friendships because that's the central friendship. And so your spouse becomes the person you confide in. And of course, when you have children, you just don't have time. and space to do anything else. But I feel that this essay rang true and then completely untrue for me. And the reason it rang untrue is that I got divorced. And, as many listeners know, I got divorced about 5 years ago. And divorce is really useful at imposing friendship, as both of you learned from my time spent with you in my period after my marriage collapsed, because you suddenly are thrown out in the world like without the person that you confided in, without the person you were talking to about everything. And you are also in the midst of having huge, deep feelings that you need to talk to people about. And so you start to confide, and when you start to confide in people, you also start to be confided in, and suddenly friendship blossoms. And so I have a much richer array of friendships as a 55-year-old than I did as a 45-year-old. And I do not recommend divorce. It's terrible, but it is a door if you let it be a door, because when you kind of like share your own failure and your own misery and your own vulnerability, other people feel that they can share it back to you. And I want to actually there's this wonderful line that really struck me, where he says, he talks about how he can't think of the time a friend with whom he'd held a hug for more than a millisecond, and a male friend. And it just got me thinking. I have this wonderful friend, Ben Cooley. Hello, Ben Cooley. Ben Cooley, who lives in LA. Cooley, yeah, for sure. And Ben Cooley,
I have no idea.
After he's somebody who'd been divorced, and when my marriage was on the rocks, he's somebody I started to talk to. And Ben, first of all, Ben will talk about anything. So he will talk about sex and money and vulnerability, and he will do it easily. And so that is just a great thing to have. And secondly, he holds a hug. Like, you see that guy and he gives you a hug and you're like, I have just been hugged. And it is, you don't realize, and especially at a time, if you're just like feeling physically vulnerable, you don't realize how wonderful it is to simply just be touched by someone and completely, this is just like in friendship. It's totally, there's no erotic charge to it. It's just the physical pressing of your skin. And it's magnificent. And I would say, like, to all of you out there, if you can be a Ben Cooley to somebody, be a Ben Cooley to somebody. Give a long hug, and men, give a long hug and talk to your friends about the shit that seems like is important, but is embarrassing. Namely, your emotions, your sex life, your money, all of those things.
I think it also, and this is something I couldn't figure out where it comes from, but I have lots of those friendships from high school and adulthood. I guess I could understand it in theory, but
well, you've been really successful, like to a remarkable degree, at least in my experience of comparing other men our age, John. I mean, those friendships seem really deep and lasting and meaningful, and it seems like you put thought and effort into them, but also they just keep going. And I don't know, I'm kind of awed by that, honestly.
Well, but it also, when I was thinking about this too, is the friendship that we have. Some of the things that seem to me to make these kinds of friendships so nourishing is one of the key characteristics of it, and it's been salvational for me in life, is the friends you have who remind you who you are, and that is not always reminding you of who you are in the best possible light. It's just that to be around somebody who has that, who knows a secret about you, essentially, that you thought was known only to yourself, is amazing. And so when I started to think about this, I kept putting you two guys in this category, and I was like, wait, Emily's not a dude.
Well, they don't have to be dudes. That's the other thing. They don't have to be dudes.
I think that's the thing that I was having difficulty kind of fitting in the boxes that were presented for me by the reading.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that you can have platonic friendships that are across the male-female boundary, and they can totally count. That completely.
I know, and I think that's true. I mean, you, Emily, have lots of good male friends, and both, John, you and I both. Well, I won't speak for you. I have tons of female friends who I consider deeply intimate.
I also wonder two things. One is, I wonder if an area of exploration might be the real benefit of non-marital friendships, because I think the point is quite well made that once marriage changed and the relationship with a spouse replaced some of these male friendships. But the benefits, I certainly know Anne benefits from this, and I think I do, but at a lesser degree, because she is less objectionable than I am. But having a set of friendships that are a release valve for not just complaints about your spouse, although that's quite important, I think, but is also like, you want to have friends around whom you can be just kind of dumb and you can be slightly annoying and all that stuff which you would never really actually want to be around your spouse, because for a variety of different reasons, including like, but you also can't always be perfect. So you need these kinds of friendships to be imperfect and get that all out of your system so you can be a better spouse.
I mean, isn't it also partly about how life has to change over time, right? I mean, one of the crazy things about getting married and staying married is this idea that like you're going to be enough like your 20-something self if that's when you got married, that like this person who was a good fit for you then, you're still going to be interested. Okay. So that all has always seemed to me like a kind
Sometimes
of crazy.
it doesn't happen.
Sometimes it totally doesn't work and people are better off separating. But if you are going to stay in a companionate marriage, I think that one of the tricks is to realize that it's never going to be everything, that you always need to be having certain things you need and want to do and ways you want to be in the world that are not going to be through your companionate marriage, no matter like how romantic plus best friend it's going to be. And friendships are an outlet for that, right? And they can change over time too. You can change who you're close to, or you can be lucky maybe and have some old friends who, like you said, John, remind you who you are, but are kind of outside of your household framework.
Yeah. Wait, can I just maybe probe? I'm not probing because I'm not going to ask you about yourselves, but one of the interesting points you just made, Emily, so that you marry someone at 27, you're 47, 57, you're not the same person. You've gone through all these things. So much has happened. You've changed. And so it's important to have these other people you can connect with in different ways, other people you can talk to about things that you are not comfortable talking about with your spouse, or it's somehow more enriching. Is that also true for sex? Like, shouldn't we then be less intolerant of people who say, you know, my marriage is great, but like we are not the same people sexually we were when we were 27. And like, therefore, a piece of our marriage is that we are finding sexual satisfaction in these other people. And that's okay. I think we have a sense like, oh, this is okay for friendship. Like, of course you can have friends who provide something your spouse doesn't, but that sex is this box, which cannot be breached in the same way for marriage to survive, which is just it's a note. It's not I don't know that I have any further thing to say about it. It's
super wise and all, but you should probably also throw religion in there as a challenge, because of course you could imagine a situation where a companionate marriage, one of the things that grows tighter through lived experience from this long marriage is a shared relationship with your religion. And if you were married in a church and that's a strong part of it, that part of your companionate marriage might get quite strong. But then if you're in a marriage and you're religious, then that would mitigate against what you just talked about, David, which is the inevitable natural challenges of sex and sexual desire across marriage and age and gender, that would probably make that complicated.
Obviously, this piece gave us a lot to think about.
One other thing that I thought that I loved, but also found somewhat limiting, is these great descriptions in the pieces we had in our research about male friendships of the past that were deep and powerful, and their letters between men. So all the articles contain the line that say, well, homosexuality was not approved of, and so this could have been that kind of relationship, but it maybe wasn't. But I am sure in a country of 300 million people, there are non-romantic, deep male friendships. And I feel like I have at different times those kinds of friendships that would essentially create the modern equivalent of these old letters that are in these pieces. So, I mean, I guess my point is a couple of examples from the past of deep male relationships. Surely there are analogs in our current world. So it was difficult for me to use, although I was quite happy to know about the past and think about it in that way. I felt like it wasn't so nourishing in arguing for the disappearance of that in our modern life, because I'm sure you could find that in some number of male relationships. It might not be huge, but the argument from the past was not proved that there were huge amounts of these male relationships.
My final note to any men or women listening is, like, it is one of the points that he makes, which I think we all know is true from our own lives, is a little bit of effort in a friendship makes a huge difference. And if you reach out to somebody with your own question, doubt, vulnerability, concern, they will respond with love and sympathy, and then they will offer it back to you. They will confide in you too, and you will find something richer. And so, like, take the chance on vulnerability. Take the risk on it, because it will be rewarded, and you'll be less lonely and more connected. All right, let's go to cocktail chatter then. When I'm on my mandates, Emily, I often have a cocktail, always have a cocktail, and chatter with my good bros, with my fellas. What are you going to be chatting?
Man dates. I was like, mad dates, like ordered things. Okay, now I understand the phrase that you were saying.
Mr. Bazelon does not use the term mandate.
No, he should though.
What are you going to chatter about?
I cannot let this week pass without marveling at these pay-to-play pardons that are coming from President Trump. I mean, there are the really rich people who are just, like, clearly, honestly, just buying their pardons. And then there are these, like, gang of rogues politicians who were convicted of tax fraud and corruption and bribery and just, like, all the bad stuff, including my own former governor, John Rowland in Connecticut. Like, these are just, it's, when you look at this list of people, it is, I think, what Ed Martin, the wannabe U.S. attorney in D.C., who's now at the Justice Department leading the pardon process, he said, no MAGA left behind. I mean, there's just an incredibly specific profile of people who Trump and his allies are interested in letting off the hook in this way. And it is either you buy your way into it or you claim kind of political persecution when in fact you were defrauding the American people. And this seems to be the two chief categories.
I'm going to jump the queue and just do my chatter, because I know that John's got a chatter that I wish I was doing. My chatter is, oddly, it is basically the same chatter I did last week, which I only realized as I was looking at, so I have a document where I just, like, drop all my notes. And as I was dropping my notes for this week's chatter, I realized, oh, wait, but my chatter last week was basically the same. So last week I talked about how there was a honeybee crisis in American agriculture, and it's being exacerbated by some incredibly stupid and short-sighted Trump policies that and could devastate the honeybee crops. This week, there's an excellent story by Sarah Zong in The Atlantic called "The Man-Eater Screwworm is Coming," and it's an amazing story about this parasite that is a devastating parasite that it eats animals alive. It literally eats cattle alive. It eats humans alive if you let it.
And who wouldn't?
And who wouldn't? If you can get a delicious bit of Dickerson flesh. So for much of American history, these screwworms were endemic in the U.S. cattle population and caused huge amounts of devastation. But after World War II, there was a massive effort, and so fascinating. They would breed screwworms by the hundreds of millions in factories. They would irradiate them, and then they would drop these irradiated and now sterile screwworms in the United States. And they would breed, these sterile screwworms would breed with the non-sterile screwworms, and they would have no offspring, and thus screwworms would die out. But they would do it week after week. They would breed millions and millions of screwworms and drop them by airplanes. And gradually they pushed the screwworm down, 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 all the way through Mexico, all the way through Central America, all the way south of Panama. And what's happened, and so there was no more screwworm, and that made the Mexican and Central American cattle safe, and it allowed for lavish beef imports and exports in all directions. But in the last few years, the screwworms have gotten loose, and they've gotten north of the Darien Gap. And now they've gotten up into central Mexico. And once they're in central Mexico, they basically cannot be stopped until they get, they'll get to the United States inevitably. And it's going to require, so we're still dropping irradiated screwworms, but now we're not dropping enough. And it's going to require sort of a 10x or maybe like 50xing the number of screwworms to beat this back. Otherwise, there's going to be just a massive infection of cattle. And this is why live cattle are no longer being allowed to be exported from Mexico to the United States, for fear of this spreading even faster. Great story. Fascinating.
That seems like the foreign invasion we should be concerned about. Let's turn our enemies to the screwworms, away from humans.
Irradiate millions of screwworms.
There were so many low grade dad jokes to respond out of that I want a cookie for not engaging in either of them, any of them. My chatter, I got a lot of things to say today. So Bear with, gang. Yeah, exactly. The first is there's just an extraordinary story in the New York Times by Jason DeParle about it's about this guy named Anthony Forrest, but more broadly, it is about who is homeless in Washington. But it is about the fact that the baby boom generation has a particular homelessness challenge because of the pounding that generation has taken, and the specific proximate cause of the most recent situation for the main character in this piece, but as the broader point, is that Anthony Forrest's mother, with whom he lived, died, or went into a nursing home, I should say, and as a result, he was put out on the street. And the uptick of homelessness or of unhoused people that's coming from this cohort is larger than previous generations. In other words, we basically have more older people on the streets than we used to because of in part the pounding that this particular generation took. Anyway, it's a incredibly painful story to read, but just beautifully done and reported. My other chatter is about, did you guys see the Neanderthal art that was discovered? Apparently 43,000 years ago, some Neanderthal saw a pebble or stone and it looked like a human face. And so it took a finger, put it in red pigment, and put the finger where the nose would be. And so created a piece of art out of this face-like looking piece of rock. And so they have discovered that it is one of the oldest pieces of art, and also shows that Neanderthals not only had a variety of different ways of pronouncing their name, but also had this kind of abstract sense that they didn't think they had before. And also, it seems to me, is the first observable act of pointillism. My actual chatter is about the 10th president, John Tyler, who, as you may remember, came into office after William Henry Harrison died just 31 days into his presidency in 1841. This set up a real battle over whether, in fact, John Tyler was the president. They called him His Excellency because he there were plenty of people who claimed he wasn't rightfully the president. And so the principle had to be later codified in the 25th Amendment that the line of succession, in fact, made the vice president president. But there are other interesting things about John Tyler, including after leaving office, he returned to Virginia and became a supporter of succession, and was later then elected to the House of Representatives in the Confederacy, which has always freaked me out.
That's crazy. I didn't know that.
Wow. Exactly. Now, he died before taking office, but he took the wrong path. But the reason we're talking about him today is that he fathered more children than any other U.S. president. He had 15 children, 8 with his first wife, Letitia, 7 with his second wife, Julia, whom he married as president, which made him the first to marry in office. But due to the unusually long generational gaps, because they set up an interesting cross-generational situation with the Tyler family, he was in his 60s when he had his last child. So his 15th child, the 15th grandson, then was also in his 60s.
70s.
Was he in his 70s?
75. He was 75.
So his 15th child was 75 when he had John Tyler's grandson, whose name was Harrison Ruffin Tyler. And Harrison Ruffin Tyler lived to be 96 years old and passed away just recently, which means the generations, he spanned 200 years. So you essentially had John Tyler's grandchild was still alive until just recently. He was a preservationist and a chemical engineer who lived in Richmond. Anyway, but there was, for a long time, one of the great presidential trivia facts was that grandchild of a president from the 19th century was still alive.
Yeah, I mean, can I go even deeper?
Please do it.
Yeah.
Go.
So John Tyler is born in 1790. He's born in the basically the first year of the George Washington's presidency. And John Tyler's grandchild died this weekend. Like that, there is in this family, the entire span of United States history exists in these three generations is amazing. That's just amazing to think about.
The entire span of the presidency.
The presidency.
Maybe even more specifically, but I
knew you were
sure.
I knew you were going to pedantically correct it there.
Well, no, well, because I've been thinking about the American Revolution for a while, and that, so anyway, but it's amazing. I didn't mean to ruin your point, which was a good one.
Yeah.
Although I fear I may have.
Anyway, I am stunned at that grandchild was alive until this weekend. Just stunned. Listeners, go ahead.
What does one do with that? I am too. But then where do we go? Like, I feel like that should excite some second thought or larger perspective, or at least a Slate hot take, which hasn't quite hit me yet.
I was talking to my mother about it, and my mother, who is 86, she was saying she remembers going when she was a child in Brooklyn in the 1950s, going to, I guess they were parades, the Brooklyn Day Parade, and that on the Brooklyn Day Parade floats were Civil War veterans, like men who'd been born, in the late 1840s who were still alive in the early 1950s. So,
wow. That's
something. Judith Plotz, new Civil War veterans. Listeners, you have chatters. Please email us new chatters. We could use a batch. We could use a bolus of new chatters. Please email them to us at gabfest@slate.com. Something you're talking about on your mandate, when you're done talking about the Tyler family, anything like that. So send them to us, gabfest@slate.com. And our listener chatter this week comes from Jody Litvak in Los Angeles.
Hi, Gabfest. My chatter is about a movie called The Stamp Thief. It's a documentary about a crazy caper. One of the producers of the film, Gary Gilbert, is a successful Hollywood producer and writer, including being one of the original writers and producers of Seinfeld. He becomes aware of a building in Legnica, Poland, where a Nazi officer may have hidden valuable stamps taken from Jews. Together with friends and others along the way, the stamp thief documents their efforts to research and then go to Poland to try and retrieve the stamps. The whole scheme is insane, and it may remind you of the film Argo. While the Holocaust isn't funny, you'll laugh. At least I did. Check it out at thestampthief.com. Love the show. Thanks.
We are not the only Slate podcast that is hopping this week. Our friends at Death, Sex, and Money have a really interesting episode, Betraying a Friendship to Get a Viral Story, and it's about the blogger AJ DeLorio, and he broke the Brett Favre sexting scandal in 2010. Huge story, but it came at a cost, and the cost was that he betrayed his own friend, Jen Sturger, who was the center of the story, woman at the center of the story, and he exposed her to sexting with, or Brett Favre sexting to her, and that caused all kinds of distress for Sturger, betrayed the friendship, but just caused her misery. And it's about how that's played out in their lives and how they eventually sort of came to communicate again. So really interesting idea for an episode. That is all for our episode this week. We also have a bonus episode in your feed. We're going to talk about President Trump's attack on big law firms and whether it's succeeding or failing. That's only for Slate Plus members, who also get bonus episodes of other Slate podcasts, special discounts to live shows, never hitting the paywall on the Slate site. So if you are a member, thank you. Enjoy it. If you're not a member, you can subscribe to Slate Plus directly from the Political Gabfest show page on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or visit slate.com/Gabfest Plus to get access wherever you listen. That's our show for today. Our researcher is Emily Ditto. Our theme music is by They Might Be Giants. Ben Richmond is Senior Director for Podcast Operations for Emily Bazelon and John Dickerson. I'm David Plotz. Thanks for listening. We will talk to you next week.